We live in a world where headlines are written to grab attention rather than to clarify. Spin, selective framing, and deliberate distraction often cloud the truth, leaving people polarised, misinformed, or simply exhausted by the noise.
Fact and Friction was born out of the need to slow down, strip away the theatre of contemporary media, and examine what's really going on when narratives clash.
Every episode will dive into the points of tension, the friction, where fact meets spin, where evidence collides with ideology, and where competing truths are put to the test.
Our purpose isn't to lecture or to preach. Often it won't even get to the ground truth, but to unpick, challenge, and illuminate.
So we aim to help you, our listener, to see through the haze of modern media, offering you clarity without oversimplification, and provide a balanced perspective that offers every side of the argument. So let's get to the episode. Okay, Sean, we've walked through now three major mechanisms of the information systems around us. We've talked about the attention engine, we've talked about rabbit holing, where the emotion comes in, and then how the emotion is optimized, we talked about in terms of A/B testing. I think the question for me now is, what is the content and how much of that is actually, quotes, real content? So let's today talk about, as we said we would, the synthetic reality of the information environment around us.
Indeed, and thanks, Harry. So I think there's been an assumption for pretty much the whole history of the internet that when we're reading something or consuming it in any way, it's actually the thoughts, opinions and products of other human beings, if you like. But increasingly, that is no longer a safe assumption. So we are seeing huge amounts of volume now being created, and that's all types: news articles, product reviews, commentary, social media posts, etc., are generated not by people, but by machines. And the algorithms that produce them are now getting more and more convincing. They can produce these articles in seconds at very limited cost, and we'll come and talk about that in a moment, and at a scale that human writers simply cannot match. And that's really what I mean by synthetic environment. And then we'll come on and talk about why it's increasingly difficult to tell whether that was written by a personal algorithm and then what to do about it.
So I guess if we go back a number of decades, the newsrooms of the world would have been filled with journalists, editors, quality control systems, etc., to ensure that what went out was more or less correct, I guess, and that was all generated by a person either hitting a keyboard or describing something in a video or something. Now, what you're saying is, among other factors, costs drive out the need for technology to replace them, and the speed at which this stuff can be generated is also allowing it to scale at a level that you just simply can't do with probably even an army of people. So if we've got AI generating the content, I guess the question then becomes, and we'll come back to this later, I know, but it becomes, how do we know that it's right? Now, how do we know that the humans before them were right? But the reality now, it's not even a human doing it. It's just a machine pumping out stuff in accordance with some instructions it's been given.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. It was about economies of scale, and there is more to it than that. But if you think about how long it's taken either of us to do the research notes for this, I mean, on and off, okay, but maybe 3 or 4 days. But if you think that an algorithm can create that in literally seconds, now we'll come and talk about accuracy and all the rest of it later.
Yeah.
But that at a time when we are, as society, absorbing information in a totally different way, and we'll probably come and talk about attention span as well, that the journalists and the big media outlets are really struggling, or have really struggled financially to keep that traditional journalism going. And so there's a spectrum in terms of, do we use AI as a tool, or can we actually create the content? And I think, again, as we've spoken in the background, the algorithms they don't reward accuracy, they reward engagement.
Yeah.
The so what of that is that if it's optimized for keywords, emotions, novelty, it can perform extremely well in terms of who's going to read it and therefore the revenue compared to that content by humans, which may be more objective, but it also might not generate that same level of emotion.
Yeah, I think it's another implication though, surely, and that is that previously, if I had issue with something I read, well, at least in theory, I could reach out to a human being and have a conversation with them and discuss the pros and cons of what they'd said. Now what you're saying is that's been produced by a machine and there is no discussion to be had with that machine. So if that content that I'm looking at is then used to feed another machine, so the algorithms are pulling in material from elsewhere, you've got bad information feeding new inquiries, which is now being fed by bad information, and therefore the domino effect is increasingly bad outcomes.
We're going way ahead of ourselves,
yeah, sure,
because that's what we're going to get into, because that's when it gets really quite...
Are we going to talk about hallucinations?
We will talk about hallucinations briefly, yes, good. We will. But the moment is just in terms of, okay, why are we seeing this? And as we've mentioned, it's the economics and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
There is, again, for balance, it's not just a negative, because you and I could just with a rudimentary knowledge of whichever happens to a tool we use, AI tool, can create our own journalism, our own news, our own opinions, all the rest of it. And that opens up stuff to a lot more people who don't necessarily want to sit down and craft huge amounts of prose or aren't necessarily that way inclined, but they can still get their point across. Now, as you rightly mentioned, the accuracy and the truth, if you like, is all an issue there. But the fact is that it makes writing stuff or content, because it's not just the written content, videos, you name it.
Sure.
It makes it far more accessible to anybody.
I know I'm jumping around a little bit here, but doesn't that also bring into question the expertise that you assume the person who's wrote it has? Now, I'm not talking about in terms of testing their expertise, but how does the person that's a non-expert on a topic but has used AI to enable them to write an article into whatever media know that what the AI has done is reasonable? I mean, how do they even begin to know if it's right if they don't have expertise themselves?
And that's where the tradecraft comes in, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Because, and this is the hybrid approach that, you don't necessarily need, and we will talk about how you identify them in a moment, but you don't necessarily need the entire article to be produced by the AI. You just need enough in there to maybe prompt you, and I think that's a very legitimate use of the algorithms, or to lead you into an argument. The challenge comes when you, exactly as you said, trust that and just go, right, I'm just going to go with that. And actually I don't need to do anything else.
Particularly when timescales are short, as they often are in journalism. I see from the work you've done here, you've got a particular example here which I quite like. The Associated Press, for example, has been using automated systems for some time to produce otherwise time-consuming reports, such as corporate earnings reports, sports summaries and financial updates. And that makes sense to me. That's the sort of thing a machine could do well.
Absolutely.
Right? And in so doing, it reported that AI allowed it to increase output from 300 to 3,000 earnings reports per quarter with no increase in staff. Okay, I get that. But I think the point you and I are talking about is not so much where AI machinery can do this stuff better than humans because it's just scalable. It's when it starts generating content that is in itself trying to present itself as unique as first order thought. That's where it becomes problematic, presumably.
Absolutely. And as we all say, there's lies, damn lies and statistics. In my research, I could not find a really accurate idea, because I don't think it's possible, in terms of the objective articles I read that said X amount of the stuff you read on the internet is produced by AI.
Right.
However, there have been experiments say, okay, of X amount of articles produced, Y amount of factual errors. And there was in 2023 actually, there's technology news outlet CNET. They did an experiment actually where they published a load of financial articles, but when reviewed, more than half of them, and it was a small sample size, about 77. But we found to have factual errors or misleading, and it was financial advice. Now that gets pretty serious pretty quickly, actually. And the readers actually weren't told that they were AI generated, And of course, once that was discovered, the backlash was quite significant, actually.
And doesn't that? I mean, there's another side effect there. I mean, your trust in what you read from ostensibly powerful and influential bodies in a financial sector could be driving all kinds of things in your financial planning.
Indeed.
And you're following advice which you assume to be written by a human who is an expert, only to find out that it's conjecture, it's created, and you're going to change something that is bad advice, based on bad advice.
Indeed.
So, actually just noticed in the notes here, you've got another example here, the Sports Illustrated magazine, 2022. Readers identified dozens of product reviews that appeared to be written by authors who didn't exist. Now, I suspect these days some of the technology is there to detect these anomalies, creating noise in the system. But how do we discuss content in the internet that we are all engaged with without a distinct whiff of uncertainty about the content being real and indeed generated by humans?
Exactly that. And we are going to talk about how you identify it.
Right.
But I think there's probably a step before that we do that and say, okay, why is it now so hard to identify?
Yeah,
so
right.
that Sports Illustrated one was a really good one, because it was coming up with such inanities as like, the volleyball is soft to the touch and offers excellent durability. Really? Thanks very much for that. That's very helpful. I mean, straight away you can see that is AI driven.
Yeah.
But the point on that one is that it was, some of those articles, from what I understand, without wanting to get into any litigation, were done by authors that on the face of it look credible, but nobody ever heard of them. You couldn't cite them, all the rest of it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves here.
Yeah.
So I think probably the next bit is we should talk about is why is it now so hard to identify? Because that was reasonably early days, really. Now we come on to that, and I think the first reason for that is that the obvious point is that the large language models are becoming increasingly sophisticated and produce content that is extremely fluent,
Right.
because they've learnt over time.
Right.
And as I said, as I quite rudely say, sometimes actually their prose are better than some of the humans I've seen write stuff. Often it's vague. In the old days, I mentioned the volleyball example, sometimes inaccurate language, but that's now changed.
Now, you and I have both worked in organisations where AI is increasingly involved. You've got this sort of hybrid between AI-enabled research or data collection with human curation. Now, that strikes me as being a better hybrid approach, a compromise, if you will. But it must also mean that it becomes that what is produced is more humanised. It's more believable.
Yeah.
It's been written by a human, because a human's been involved in the curation of it.
Indeed, and even more than that, actually, I think that we call it hybrid, sort of blending or whatever you want to go, where you use the basic, and I've used this technique, no question about it. So, right, give me a framework on this and tell me the issues that I want to talk about. And they've used it as a frame. And if you then putting your own personality into it, your own thoughts, that is very much a hybrid. And I think it's a good use. So this is, for balance, as always, it's a positive use of AI, very much so, as long as you've done the research to, now I'm going to talk about tradecraft. So have you researched the stuff that you're put in? Have you equally researched what the AI has told you? And then when you put it all together, does it make sense? And is it adding to the value? So, but that makes it very, very hard to identify when it's been blended like that.
So you're describing a situation which I've also tried to do as well, which is where you get the AI system to give you, for example, factors to consider when you're describing a particular situation and trying to make a decision, and it gives you some factors that you might want to consider, and then within that framework it's given you, you can start to populate the factors, the considerations, and thereby start to build this sort of analysis of the problem and come up with an answer. That's the hybrid model, right? That's
Indeed.
what
Exactly
about,
that.
right?
Exactly that.
Okay. And I can imagine, and I've certainly seen it for myself, that quite often the AI has come up with factors that I would have already come up with myself. But by the way, it saved me the trouble of recalling them. It's just presented them. But it often also provides ones that, I hadn't really thought about that one.
Or
a different nuance
I've
or
forgotten
something.
about this. Yeah, exactly.
So it's a good catch-all, I suppose. But the key thing you said there was retaining control, agency over the process, rather than blindly just saying, give me a report on, give me a decision on, give me an understanding of the things I should consider, is a step before that.
Yeah.
And letting the AI enable it.
Absolutely right. Yeah. Now there are various things in terms of getting onto detecting them. So we've mentioned a few of them already, and we'll come on a few more. But there are some tools that have been developed by AI to actually detect them. The problem they've got is that they don't generate as much revenue as the ones that actually do that. So they're lagging behind. Therefore, they're less accurate. And you've got to invest more in them. So it's a vicious circle there. But that's probably a nice little segue into what should we be looking for.
Yeah. So I think what I've heard so far in this conversation then is that synthetic content on the internet is a thing. It's largely distributed across the internet in all different channels. And one of the things that we as users of the internet, trying to find answers to things or trying to interrogate things, just need to be cognizant of is that it's entirely possible that we're collecting content that might not be entirely accurate because it was based on a synthetic set of inputs. If that's true, frankly, all that does for my mind is get an even blacker, thicker line scored under you need multiple sources, you need to verify sources.
Exactly that.
And you need to be sure about what it is you've seen at the outcome.
Exactly. And this is kind of bread and butter for us because if you recall back to our intelligence days, where just because you get a piece of intelligence that might be very highly classified does not mean it's true. Yeah. In fact, there are times when, without going into detail or back to my previous existence, where the classification, the source of something was seen as a bright, shiny object, therefore it must be true, and therefore it was overweighted. Mm-hmm. Whereas what you've got to do, and this is relevant to this, is you've got to take each single product, source, thing you read and just say, right, okay, has this been through a check and balance? How do we check against it something else? Mm-hmm. And that's another feature of AI produced stuff, actually. It tends to get repeated, and you see it in loads and loads of platforms, some of the similar words. Mm-hmm. That you go, hang on a minute, I've read that somewhere else, because it's all been repeated, and we're going to go into that downward spiral in a minute. You could say, well, that's just the same as plagiarism, which it sort of is, and of course a lot of people listening to this will know the Turnitin.coms. Yeah. That's a totally different thing, but it's the same principle in terms of, copying from somebody else. One algorithm may copy from another. Sure.
I think where I'm left though is that genie is out the bottle. AI is going to be used to generate content. What we now need to do is think about how we detect that, or how we deal with that, probably better said. Yeah. Because whilst we can spend a great deal of time lambasting the fact that AI is now generating noise, potentially noise, that's feeding other AI that's generating even more noise, the point of this conversation really is to say, so what? So how do we deal with that? Yeah. Now, I think the clues that we've talked about so far is language patterns. Experts say, studies suggest, these tend to be non-specific phrases, and the AI might actually know of studies and experts that it's reading, but it's not going to say that. It's just going to summarize it because it wants to get on with it. Repetition and duplication you mentioned just a second ago. The volume of articles, when you look at the actual articles themselves, they're individually quite shallow. There's not a great deal of depth in there. Yeah. The one thing we haven't talked about, though, so far is the lack of attribution. You know how when you were at school, you had to write an essay and you say who you'd read or who you'd referred to create this essay, and you clearly didn't copy chunks out of it, but you know what I mean, that referencing you had to do. Mm. One of the things I've noticed about AI is unless you specifically ask it to, and you can, it won't tell you where it got it from. Top tip for the listener, if you're working with an AI model that's producing something for you, ask it to show you the sources, and or ask it only to use the following sources that you know to be verified and accurate.
That's a key one, that last one actually. But just going back to those sources, I've done a few experiments actually with it where, when I'm using one of the models, I will always say, right, I want citable references, and it will give you highly credible citable references. If you click on them though, or try and identify them, I would suggest right now, and it's getting better of course, I'd say probably just under half of them don't go anywhere, or they don't exist, or you can't access them, which is another story for another day. Mm. But you think, well, that's credible, therefore you cite it. You've got to go to that, and that's a good tip for anybody. Actually, go to the source and read the source yourself.
Yeah, and by the way, one thing I've noticed from actually demanding the AI that's generating things for me gives me its sources is how frequently a very small number of sources are used. Here's a further thought. Run exactly the same process, exactly the same set of questions the following day or the following hour, and it's very likely the AI will generate a very similar answer, but from a different set of sources.
Yeah, indeed.
By the way.
Indeed.
All right.
That's right. Just before we get off to the, how do we detect these, there are some newer techniques coming on board. One of them is AI watermarking, which I won't pretend to understand fully, but what it does is actually embeds a discrete machine detectable signal into AI generated content, which is almost like that tags that particular piece. You can't detect it other than through the AI. Over time, that might improve detection rates, but I mean, the fact is that all of that, there have been some experiments that reckon that AI generated text can only be determined by humans about 50% of the time, when that's using all the tools. When random guessing also receives about 50% accuracy, even following the training. So
I think the message there is very, very hard to detect, increasingly hard now to detect where AI has generated content, because it's written in a way that is so much more plausible. But I think all that does is, again, underscore the need for good process, good tradecraft, to ensure that you don't fall into the trap of just blindly following something because you haven't bothered to check it.
Indeed.
Now, in the event you are very short of time, and you and I probably spend more time doing this stuff than almost any normal human being does, one thing I would say, though, is go back, and I said it a minute ago, is try very, very hard to at least ask it for the sources that it used to generate this product. And then, as you just said, follow a couple of the sources. If the first source you try turns out to be non-existent, doesn't actually exist, big question mark should be popping in your mind in terms about what you're about to read.
Yeah.
All right. So we indicated, or I think hinted earlier, that this AI content can accelerate misinformation.
Indeed.
And by the way, of course, if it's deliberately put into the system to create disinformation, that's a different outcome, but it's a very similar process. So why does AI content accelerate misinformation, I guess, is where we should go next.
Yeah, okay. I think just before that, though, just probably worth clarifying some terms, because these terms are really interchanged, and it is one of my bugbears, actually. So there's a big difference between misinformation, hallucination, and disinformation.
Okay.
We'll talk about disinformation in a moment, but as always, there's no definitive definitions. But misinformation, as we discuss it, you and I, is the inadvertent spread of false information, specifically without the intent to cause any harm.
Yeah.
Now, hallucinations, again produced by AI models sometimes, are answers that have been generated the way that the algorithms work as a possible or probable correct answer based on the patterns of training of the data that they're using. But they just come up with something that is just factually incorrect and quite often totally incoherent. So there are different things. So misinformation is the baseline information being wrong. Hallucination is just rubbish that's created by the algorithm themselves.
All right, and just to finish off that sequence of definitions, disinformation is where information is deliberately inserted to give you the wrong outcome or misimpression.
Exactly that.
Okay, so let's talk then about why, if AI content can accelerate that misinformation environment, because that's ultimately what we care about. Because if we're going to retain agency, retain control over our information systems that we want to use for our own day-to-day life, we're going to need to know how to identify it.
Yeah, indeed, absolutely right. And there's a really important point here, and I think this is the main point for this segment, as far as I'm concerned, is that the AI doesn't always make the false information more convincing. So it doesn't create the AI and go, the misinformation itself, or even amplify it, but it makes it easier to produce in volume. And so that matters, particularly at a time when information is accessed by, attention spans, low attention spans, small bites, all that sort of thing. And so sheer persistence and ubiquity, word, means that misleading content proliferates and reaches a much wider audience. And then that leans into stuff that we've talked about before. Once that's into the psyche, if you want to call it that, into the sort of the platforms, it's really hard to change that view, because people have moved on. So that's the perceived reality is now the reality.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing some of this, aren't we, in this legal case that's ongoing.
Yes.
In the US, where they're looking at Meta and Facebook, and they're talking about the fact that the environment of information which is shaped by the AI is creating an environment where we're seeing the same thing over and over and over again, and the exposure is the multiple exposures is creating this sense of reality, even when it's all entirely false or fabricated content.
And it also reaches back into one of the previous podcasts where we talked about both the A/B testing, but also the rabbit holes, in terms of it can unintentionally, because of what we've talked about before, prioritize that sensational leading content.
Because it was generating a lot of engagement.
Because it generated the interest, which then increases engagement further with false narratives, and it is a vicious circle.
Yeah. So it becomes an environment where misinformation is spreading rapidly, even without deliberate manipulation here, which was the disinformation side, purely because you've got this full spectrum of media formats all pumping this information in. And now, of course, you've got bots, automatic accounts on social media that can generate or manipulate text, images and video, and I think as well audio. And this creates this massive system of capabilities, multimodal kind of capabilities, I think they're called, that make it look so much more believable. If you saw the same story on video, listened to it, read it, multiple different ways, it becomes a reality because you've been bombarded with it from every direction. It must be true, right? I've seen it everywhere. Everyone's talking about it.
Absolutely right. And, as we just said as well, if you don't have the time, inclination to go, I'm not sure that's true, particularly if you're seeing it, so much of it, you're just gonna accept it, aren't you?
Yeah. So I saw a report recently about why it's so difficult to rebut mis and disinformation. And the argument was that it was very hard to do because it takes 10 times as much effort to dispel a mistruth, a falsehood in the information environment. 10 times of effort to get the same level of interaction. And one other thing that was linked to that is once something has gone, quotes, viral, even if the original post is corrected, the false version just continues to endure across the entire system. I mean, you think about machine learning as an algorithm that understands something has changed, that's getting closer to where it wants to be, so it knows how to implement the change that it wants across the entire spectrum, and it spreads it quickly. To my knowledge, there aren't any machine unlearning algorithms running. So when you've put in the original post and you've corrected it, it then goes to all the places that spread and unwinds it. That just doesn't happen. What about disinformation then, the state actor angle? Now, before we go into this part, let's be clear, we're still focused in this podcast series around how we as consumers of information can understand these things and then what we can do about it to retain some degree of control. But in this case, we're now moving away from the algorithm per se, trying to do it for essentially economic reasons, it being maintaining some sort of engagement, continuing engagement, to now the state actor that's got some specific, could be an NGO, but not an NGO, a non-state group. Group.
Often it is,
But how do we take a slightly more, just for the interest's sake, the national security perspective? It's not just misinformation that's amplified by the automation, but also disinformation.
And of course, it's the same process, but there's just nefarious reasons behind it, and it's done at scale. So the way that misinformation is prioritised and spread is exactly the same with disinformation. This is where the state and non-state actors, as you said, quite often state-sponsored, come in, because they know that these algorithms do that, and of course, the rabbit holes and all the rest of it. They manipulate all of that, and it makes it easier for them to flood the social media with false narratives, manipulate stories, misleading commentary, all that sort of stuff. Now, the so what of that, and it's a big so what, is that by doing that, it can undermine trust. And it's something we've been talking about throughout, actually, and what people are told by full spectrum, might be by politicians, commentators, scientists, for instance. It doesn't really matter, because the overall intent tends to be to destabilise particularly liberal democracies, undermine alliances even. So, when you're talking about your friends, like, oh, why aren't they helping us, sort of thing. And it challenges the international rules order, in terms of this is what they use to destabilise, for their own political agenda. We call it hybrid warfare because it's under the
threshold.
Yeah, under the threshold, exactly that.
Yeah.
And that's when polarised views become more polarised. I don't want to make a huge issue of it, but it is something we need to be cognizant of because it's getting more, and it is further polarised.
Well, at the state level, what you've described is clearly important geopolitically, but I'm going to bring us back down a level or two here because I want to keep us focused on the day-to-day life we all live with our information systems. But just for the listener, remain cognizant of the fact that there is a bigger play going on here in the national security arena. Conscious that time is catching up with us because we don't want to be here for too long. Let's turn to our point of friction. We still consume information as if it were created by humans. Well, maybe we're starting to get a little bit suspect on that, but there's an acceptance that its creation is limited by time, experience, knowledge, even accountability. But an increasing share of what we read or see, we need to understand, is generated by machines. And they're optimized for scale, engagement, not necessarily for accuracy and accountability, as you were saying earlier, Sean. And our instincts for judging credibility and accuracy have not yet adapted. Now, that's the bit I want to focus in on, is how do we learn, how do we become more adapted to an environment where content is generated continuously in vast quantities from all directions without the benefit of any verification or authorship? Now, for me, it goes back to page 1 of Tradecraft, which is all about this multi-sourcing and this curiosity driven by a specific set of questions rather than just following your nose. And I think that's, for me, the takeaway. The audience need to just slow down, not take anything at face value anymore, and just try very, very hard to, at the very least, ask it to prove the sources.
Indeed. Yeah, it's back down to the, when you've got multiple inputs, similar content, but without authoritative authorship, say, just ask yourself, is this authentic? What is it trying to tell me? And is it trying to lead me to a particular perspective? Because it does matter. And it's all about the trust word. We use the trust word an awful lot, but that's trust in the information, and trust in what our deductions are from that information, which may not be right.
Yeah, very good. All right. Time is now running out on us, so let's just summarise very quickly what we've done so far. We've talked about the attention engine. We've talked about how that is driving into rabbit holes with the emotional content added to it to catalyse it somewhat. The emotional content being driven by experimentation, so-called A/B testing, to find the best optimised set of emotional content to really drive that engagement down into the rabbit hole. And now we've talked about the fact, and that's driving synthetic reality, not always real and accurate content. Whew. Okay, so there's a lot to think about here.
There is.
There's one thing we haven't talked about yet, which is what I'm going to call outrage as a business model. Now, I don't know about you, Sean, but I've read way too many articles and headlines that start with this exclamation mark, are you aware of this outrage?
Yeah.
And going back to what I just said about rabbit holing and A/B testing, I think it's about time we started looking at outrage as a business model, because I think that's driving the information economy. So I suggest that next time we spend a bit of time talking about outrage, exclamation mark, as the business model.
As someone easily outraged, that sounds like a good idea to me.
For the listener, we've now gone through our 4th podcast, and as you, I hope, have detected for the first 4, we're really keen to stay focused on mechanisms, things that are happening, and trying to give some guidance in terms of what's happening, how you might understand it, detect it, and then do something about it. It's about now that it's time for me to say to you, as the listeners, if you disagree with what we said, great, let us know. If you agree but wanted more, great, let us know. If you want to get engaged in the conversation, we are very, very open for business. Do let us know. Thanks for your time. Until the next time, bye-bye. That's it for today's episode of Fact and Friction. Thank you for listening. If you found this useful, follow the podcast for more or go to our website, lumini.org.
We really would welcome any questions and feedback you might have. And if you'd like to go deeper, you'll find links to the research and the show notes in the episode description.
And as always, stay curious, question the noise, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.